There is a pattern that defines most lives: the compulsion to care. It starts early, reinforced by culture, language, and the silent expectations of others. Individuals are taught that significance comes through emotional investment, that to react is to be alive. But this is the first illusion, because in every reaction, control is lost. The more one shows they care, the more visible their strings become. And visible strings are always pulled. You spend your life being baited. They teach you to respond, to words, to silence, to attention, to rejection. And every time you take the bait, you become easier to read, easier to manipulate. The truth is, they don't need to hurt you, to break you. They just need to make you care. Because when you care, you attach. When you attach, you serve. And when you serve, you become a tool. Predictable, emotional, replaceable. Every time you react, you pay a price. That flinch, that desperate explanation, that craving for approval. It's all a broadcast. You think you're defending yourself, but what you're really doing is handing them your blueprint. Niccolò Machiavelli once wrote that men are driven more by fear of loss than hope of gain. And nothing makes you more fearful than caring too deeply. Your fear reveals where you're weakest. You believe your sensitivity makes you human, but they see it as a weapon they can use. Your kindness becomes their camouflage. Your empathy becomes their entry point. You apologize to keep the peace. You explain to seem understood. You offer softness hoping they'll return it. But in their world, every show of emotion is a move in a game. And you're losing. You weren't born weak. You were trained to be soft, trained to believe that harmony is worth your self-respect, trained to believe that being liked is more important than being respected. And now you're easy to provoke, easy to read, and worst of all, easy to predict. Predictability is the graveyard of power. The moment they can guess your reaction, they own it. So you stop. You stop explaining. You stop defending. You stop offering fragments of your soul in the name of connection. You walk into rooms like a mirror, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. You answer slowly. You smile only when you mean it. You allow silence to stretch longer than it should. And every time you don't react, you make them nervous. Your detachment becomes unsettling because people are addicted to emotional signals. They need them to know where they stand. And when you give them nothing, they scramble, they project, they panic because they don't fear your anger. They fear your indifference. Indifference is the fog that drowns their need for control. This is the shift from emotional prey to emotional predator. Not through cruelty, but through refusal. You no longer give them what they crave. You become unpredictable, silent, cold, not out of malice, but clarity. You've seen the structure of the game. You've stopped caring about the outcome, and when you no longer need to win, they can no longer make you lose. There is no law more powerful than silence in the face of provocation. Each time you withhold your energy, you preserve your leverage. Each time you choose stillness over validation, you remind them they cannot reach you. Your detachment is not passivity. It is power. It is the ability to exist beyond their reach. You are no longer their puppet, no longer the echo of their opinions, no longer desperate to be chosen, understood, or seen. You walk away before they finish speaking. You respond without urgency. You give nothing of yourself to those who haven't earned it. And slowly, your absence begins to speak louder than your presence ever did. Because the moment you stop caring, truly stop, you become untouchable. You become unreadable. And when they cannot read you, they cannot control you. What they once used against you becomes useless. Their leverage dissolves. Their power fades. And all that's left is a silence they cannot invade. Control often begins with sound, not in what is said, but in the expectation that something must be said. People are trained to speak, to defend, to explain. Noise becomes a shield, a currency of emotional presence. But this habit forms a trap because the one who must speak is already subordinate to the one who simply watches in silence. The balance of power quietly shifts. You've been conditioned to explain yourself. Every insult invites a defense. Every accusation demands a response. And every moment you speak, you validate their power. You think clarity is strength, but in truth, it's exposure. The need to be understood is the leash around your neck. And every time you react, you tighten it with your own hands. The silence begins slowly. You stop correcting their assumptions. You stop defending your name. And suddenly, their grip loosens because they don't need to be right. They just need you to prove you care. The moment you don't, they lose control. A wise man, Machiavelli wrote, ought to accept the character of the times. And in times of deceit, nothing is more powerful than refusing to explain yourself. Silence becomes the knife that cuts their influence cleanly from your skin. They will push harder. They will bait you with louder accusations, harsher tones, more public shaming. But they are not attacking you. They are starving because your silence has robbed them of the one thing they need, your emotional response. You watch their desperation grow. You listen without blinking. And the less you speak, the more they reveal themselves. There's a discomfort in silence, not for you, for them. They're used to performance. They rely on your noise to measure their control. But now, the script has no actor. You leave their words unanswered, their drama unplayed. You walk away before they finish the sentence, and it destroys them. Because silence is not just a tactic, it is a verdict. You once thought silence meant defeat, that by not speaking, you were letting them win. But now you understand. Silence is the refusal to participate in their script. It is the rejection of their illusion. You don't need to convince them you're right. You don't need to prove anything. Because when they cannot pull a reaction from you, they begin to drown in their own reflection. Your detachment becomes a mirror. In your silence, they see their irrelevance. In your stillness, they feel their power evaporate. And the more they try to provoke you, the more unstable they look. People begin to notice, not your reaction, but their unraveling. This is the reversal. The louder they get, the weaker they appear. The quieter you remain, the stronger you become. They will call you cold. They will accuse you of arrogance, distance, cruelty. But these are the cries of someone who no longer holds the leash. They mistake your silence for emptiness, but inside that silence lives a brutal clarity, the awareness that you no longer owe them anything, not your words, not your reactions, not your attention. And in that silence, everything falls into place. You are no longer defined by how well you respond. You are defined by what you no longer need to respond to. You no longer speak to be understood. You no longer defend what doesn't need defending. You understand the most terrifying thing you can offer is not your anger, but your absence. Because silence is not the absence of emotion. It is the weaponized form of detachment, the final refusal. The last word that never has to be spoken. When you say nothing, they hear everything, and the ones who once fed on your noise, they are the first to feel the cut. Control is the grand illusion. Most human behavior is driven by the belief that with enough effort, outcomes can be shaped. People can be molded, situations can be managed. But this belief feeds obsession. It binds the mind to what it cannot touch. The more someone clings to control, the more invisible their cage becomes. Because control, at its core, is fear disguised as strategy. You've spent years adjusting yourself, softening your words, rewriting your tone, walking on emotional glass just to keep things from breaking. You called it love. You called it responsibility. But underneath, it was fear. Fear of abandonment. Fear of being seen as dispensable. So you tried harder. And the more you tried, the more invisible you became. Letting go feels like death. That silence, after not explaining yourself. That emptiness, after not chasing. You mistake it for coldness, but it's clarity. When you stop interfering, the truth begins to show. You stop talking, and they don't notice. You stop giving, and they vanish. You stop fighting for them, and they never fight back. That's not loss. That's revelation. You thought caring would save them. You thought effort was power, but it wasn't. It was theater, a performance of control that only existed in your imagination. Men in general judge more by the eyes than by the hands, Machiavelli observed. For everyone can see, but few can feel. And the more you tried to manage what was never yours, the more you blurred the line between effort and delusion. They never wanted to change. They just wanted you to carry the burden of trying. And every time you stepped in, explained their behavior, excused their patterns, fought for their potential, you gave them one more reason to stay the same. Because why grow when someone else is managing the consequences? Why improve when your dysfunction is someone else's project? There's a savage peace in doing nothing, in watching the chaos you once protected them from slowly consume them. You don't scream. You don't warn. You simply step back. And when they spiral, you realize they always needed the fall. Your control was only delaying their exposure. You weren't saving them. You were shielding them from the truth of themselves. Now, when they provoke you, you don't respond. When they collapse, you don't catch them. And the world calls it cruelty. But they didn't see the 1,000 times you held it all together. They didn't see the silent negotiations, the emotional labor, the invisible scaffolding you built so others wouldn't crumble. You see now, it was never your job. It was your mistake. You were never meant to hold everyone up. You were meant to see who stands when you stop holding. Detachment isn't abandonment. It's observation. The moment you step back, people show you who they are, not the version you imagined, not the potential you invested in. Just the raw, unfiltered reality. And most of it isn't beautiful. But freedom isn't beautiful either. It's brutal. It strips you of illusions. It forces you to accept that you never had control. Just the illusion of it. That people will self-destruct with or without your interference. That outcomes are not earned. They're chosen. And when you stop choosing for them, they reveal what they were always going to be. So now you stay silent. You stop fixing. You watch without saving. Not because you're cold, but because you've seen the cost of caring beyond your reach. The moment you let go of control, you inherit something far greater, the truth. And the truth doesn't need your effort. It just needs your distance. You don't save people by controlling them. You save yourself by not trying. And the death of that control, that final breath of exhaustion, that's where freedom begins. Not in victory, not in outcome, but in the quiet power of non-intervention. The game ends when you stop playing. When attention is removed, instability surfaces. Most relationships are built not on mutual strength, but on silent dependency. One person holds emotional balance, while the other feeds on it. When the source of that emotional fuel vanishes, the structure begins to crack. Withdrawal does not create chaos. It reveals it. And what's revealed is almost always uglier than what was imagined. You disappear, not with rage, not with explanation, but with precision. You go quiet. You stop explaining your value. You stop defending your presence. And suddenly, the silence becomes louder than anything you've ever said. That's when their mask begins to slip, because your detachment is not just absence. It's exposure. They depended on your reactions, your presence, your need to fix. Without it, they have nothing to manipulate. They don't miss you. They miss the control they had over you. They miss the power of making you flinch, the pleasure of watching you justify yourself. Now that you're still, they panic, they provoke, they manufacture crises, and when you remain unmoved, they begin to unravel. It's not your love they crave, it's your emotional servitude. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. Machiavelli wrote, "And now you see who surrounded you, not for loyalty, but for leverage." The guilt arrives next. They say you're cold, uncaring. They remind you of everything they did for you, but their memory is selective. They forget the nights you held them together, the arguments you absorbed, the chaos you managed in silence. And when guilt doesn't work, blame takes its place. They paint you as the villain, not because you wronged them, but because you refused to be used. Real loyalty doesn't need permission. It doesn't demand justification. The ones who valued you will move with grace. No outburst, no manipulation, just quiet understanding. They will respect the space and reach without force. But the users, the ones who fed on your reactions, they will implode. They were never stable. They just stood on your emotional scaffolding. Now that it's gone, they collapse under the weight of their own emptiness. You say nothing. You offer no warnings, no justifications, no explanations. And in that silence, their true character screams. Some reach out, not to reconnect, but to regain control. Others lash out, hoping to provoke a response. And some vanish entirely, their usefulness gone. Every reaction is a confession, and you've become the interrogator without speaking a word. Withdrawal isn't retreat, it's strategy. You remove yourself not to disappear, but to reveal. You don't run, you observe. You don't respond, you record. Because in that moment of stillness, you gather more truth than years of conversation ever revealed. The louder they scream, the clearer their dependence becomes. The angrier they get, the more fragile they are. And the ones who stay calm, those are the ones who never needed you as a crutch. They feared your absence, not because they loved you, but because they were nothing without your reaction. And now, without your care, they stand exposed, powerless, irrelevant. You didn't change. You simply stopped playing. And the collapse that follows isn't yours. It's theirs. Control often slips not through action, but through overinvestment. The more someone cares, the more predictable they become. Emotional urgency creates patterns. Chasing validation, seeking resolution, fearing misinterpretation. That desperation becomes readable, and what's readable becomes controllable. Indifference, in contrast, erases the signal. It creates silence, and in that silence, power emerges, clean, deliberate, untouchable. You stop explaining. That's the first shift. You let people misunderstand you, and you offer no correction. It feels unnatural at first, like silence in a room that used to echo with defense. But slowly, the stillness becomes clarity. The less you chase, the more they notice. The less you respond, the more control tilts in your favor. Emotion demanded reaction. Now, indifference demands respect. You no longer seek fairness. Only leverage. You walk into the room with no need to be liked, and suddenly every eye turns toward you. Why? Because power doesn't shout. It waits. It watches. And when the time is right, it acts. You stop filling silences. You let them reach. Let them guess. Men rise from one ambition to another, Machiavelli warned. First, they seek to secure themselves against attack. Then they attack others. Your indifference signals both. You're no longer defending, and you no longer care to strike. That ambiguity terrifies them. You say less in negotiations. You don't try to prove your worth. You allow discomfort to hang in the air. Because now, discomfort is your ally. While they scramble to interpret your silence, you interpret their desperation. Every over-explanation, every panicked apology, every attempt to pull you back, it all reveals hierarchy. And the one who reveals more loses. You stop soothing their fears. You stop rewarding their guilt trips with reassurance. You watch them spiral from your stillness alone. This is what it means to take back your emotional budget. They're not worth the investment. Every time you withhold your reaction, you reclaim another piece of power they once drained from you. Your presence is no longer a gift you hand out freely. It becomes rare, precise, transactional. The less you care, the more they want access. And the more they want, the more deliberate you become in denying it. You don't ignore them to punish. You ignore them because they're no longer relevant to your strategy. Indifference isn't the absence of feeling. It's the presence of discipline. You still feel, but you no longer broadcast it. You still see, but you no longer respond impulsively. And in that restraint, you become untouchable. No one can control what they cannot read. No one can manipulate what does not react. And that is the final turn, when your silence no longer seeks understanding, but weaponizes misunderstanding. When your calm is not passive, but surgical. When your indifference is no longer a wound, it's armor. Emotional detachment creates a paradox. It frees the mind while isolating the heart. The more a person separates from emotional dependency, the more they begin to drift from the collective, no longer moved by approval, guilt, or sentiment. But freedom isn't soft. It doesn't comfort. It demands loss. The trade is always the same. Security for sovereignty, affection for autonomy, connection for control. You begin to feel like something inside you is dying, not all at once, but slowly, like a limb losing circulation. The warmth fades. The need to explain dissolves. What once felt urgent now feels irrelevant. But this is the cost of detachment. Part of you has to die for the rest to live. You let go of the part that needed to be chosen, the part that begged to be seen. And when it fights back, and it will, you silence it. There's a sharp, invisible pain in not reacting. You watch people lie, manipulate, provoke, You hear them rewrite your story, and you say nothing. It's not passivity. It's discipline. The weaker version of you wants to scream the truth. But the version that's rising knows better. It knows, as Machiavelli warned, that injuries must be inflicted all at once so that their ill savor may be less. Your silence is the injury, not to them, but to your former self. The wound of no longer being available. You stop chasing explanations. You stop looking for closure. The idea that someone owes you an apology becomes laughable. No one owes you anything, and you owe them even less. You begin to realize how much of your life was a performance for people who never even clapped. The pain of that realization is real, but it is also a threshold. Once crossed, there is no going back. Solitude becomes a mirror. You sit in it, and it reflects everything you used to fill with distraction. The false friendships, the fragile ego, the compulsive need to be validated. At first, the silence screams, then it sharpens. You stop filling the space with noise, with people, with artificial purpose. You learn to stand alone, not as punishment, but as precision. The fewer voices around you, the clearer your own becomes. They will call you cold. They will say, "You've changed," and they're right. You are no longer bending, no longer breaking yourself into smaller pieces to be digested by smaller minds. You are no longer emotionally accessible on demand. And because of that, they panic. Detachment makes them feel invisible. Because your gaze no longer feeds their illusion. What they feel is not your cruelty, it's your absence. You don't correct them. You don't comfort them. You watch them reach for a version of you that no longer exists. This is the hidden cruelty of growth. It exposes their inability to evolve with you. You once needed their understanding. Now, you only need their distance. They are no longer part of your strategy. And deep down, they know it. The weight you carried was emotional, and it wasn't yours. You picked up guilt that wasn't yours to hold. You apologized for needs that were human. You made yourself small for people who weren't even watching. And now that you've stopped, now that you've let yourself stop, the silence feels brutal, but it's the only kind of silence that builds anything worth keeping. You don't explain your absence. You don't justify your detachment. The people who matter will remain. Not because you chased them, but because you didn't. Because you created a space where only the strong can enter, and the weak, they simply fade away, insulted by your calm. This is the price of freedom. The loss of the illusion that people ever truly cared the way you did. But it's also the beginning of power. The kind that doesn't need attention, doesn't beg for love, and doesn't break from being misunderstood. And once you feel that kind of power, quiet, clean, and absolute, no part of you will ever want to go back. When emotional need is removed, reality reveals its true shape. Without the distortions of hope, fear, or attachment, a person becomes still. And in that stillness, the world moves differently. Patterns emerge. Masks fall. The machinery of manipulation no longer functions because its fuel, your reaction, has been taken away. What remains is silence, and silence is where power begins. You stop trying to fix things. The need to explain, to repair, to be understood dies. You watch people ruin themselves with decisions they once blamed on you, and you say nothing. You stop intervening. You let them destroy what they built with lies. And as they collapse under the weight of their own games, you do the most dangerous thing imaginable. Nothing. Stillness becomes your weapon. You don't argue. You don't defend. You don't justify. Every word they throw at you lands in a void. No echo, no return. This is where your power sharpens. They begin to fear the calm. They begin to sense, as Machiavelli wrote, a man must be either pampered or annihilated. You offer neither, and that makes you untouchable. Let them lie. Let them twist. Let them scream your name into the void. You've stepped out of the emotional economy. You're no longer buying guilt, nor selling apologies. They want fire, and you give them stone. They want a reaction, and you give them nothing. They want to pull you back in, but there's nothing left to pull. The world burns, and you remain untouched, unreadable, unconcerned, because you finally realized the one who does not care cannot be controlled.